Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Sam from Historic Travels and welcome to another video. And as always, before we get started today, I'd just like to take a quick moment to welcome all my new subs and thank everybody who's been leaving me comments and messages down below. Thank you all so much, I really appreciate it. And if any of you out there would like to take a couple of extra steps to help support the channel a little bit more, there's a merch store and a Patreon for this channel in the links below. Thank you all so much for all your support. Alright guys, well hey, the time has finally come to continue the story of the RMS Lusitania. When we last left the RMS Lusitania, we had just finished discussing the vessel's golden years, and World War I had just begun. Alright guys, well hey, with that out of the way, let's now continue the story of the RMS Lusitania. On July 28, 1914, World War I officially broke out and quickly spread across Europe. Now, as a result of war breaking out, it would have a noticeable impact on the entire transatlantic shipping industry. There isn't one vessel operating in the Atlantic that wouldn't be affected by this war in some way. And of course, as you expected, this also means that the Lusitania and her sister ship Mauretania would also be impacted by this war. Not long after hostilities broke out, the British Admiralty contacted the Cunard Line and let them know that they would need both the Lusitania, along with her sister ship Mauretania, to enter service as armed merchant cruisers as quickly as possible. However, not long after this happened, the British Admiralty did some tests with both the Lusitania and Mauretania and discovered that the engines on both of these vessels, well, they really weren't suited to be used as armed merchant cruisers. Where the Lusitania and Mauretania were built to be the fastest ships on the Atlantic, the engines on these ships were efficient in terms of their coal usage if they were doing what they were intended to be used as very fast ships steaming across the Atlantic. The engines were great for this. However, in terms of being used as an armed merchant cruiser, which means that the Lusitania and Mauretania would be on patrol, sailing around the Atlantic very slowly, or these ships would be used as escort ships to help protect a convoy, well, due to the slow speed that these ships would be going at during these time periods, the engines used way too much fuel for this. They just were not practical for this type of usage. So once the British Admiralty realized this, they decided that they did not need the Lusitania and Mauretania, at least during the early stages of the war. And as you can expect, Cunard Line noticed that there was a huge drop-off in civilian passengers wanting to sail across the Atlantic during this time period. I'm not saying that there were no people wanting to sail across the Atlantic during this time period, but there were much fewer numbers than usual. So what the Cunard Line decided to do was put the RMS Mauretania in storage until this ship would be needed later. And then they decided to have the Lusitania continue operating for her transatlantic passenger service. So during the early stages of the war, the Lusitania continued to operate, going to and fro, sailing across the Atlantic, taking passengers from Europe to America and America to Europe. Then, not long after the war broke out, Germany unleashed a new and devastating weapon onto the Atlantic, the U-boat. For those of you who don't know, a U-boat is a German war submarine that was capable of hunting down and torpedoing an enemy ship and causing it to sink. Now at first, the British Admiralty didn't take the existence of these U-boats too seriously. They really didn't think that these submarines could do any major damage to the British fleet. However, as more and more time went by, the UK government saw how many ships that these U-boats were starting to sink. So, as the war continued to rage on, the British Admiralty had no choice but to accept the fact that these U-boats were something to be reckoned with. Alright, so now that we've touched on what the Lusitania was doing during this time period, and now that we've also touched on what U-boats are and why they were considered such a threat, there is one more key thing that we need to discuss before we continue the story of the Lusitania, because by understanding this, you'll have a better understanding of the series of events that are about to occur with the Lusitania. You see, what we need to talk about is a treaty that was signed in the 1800s known as the Declaration of Paris. Now, I'm not going to be going into the full extent of this treaty, but the part of it that you need to understand for this video was that this treaty had very specific rules in place in regards to naval warfare. And this treaty was also signed by 55 countries, including Germany. So that's also a key reason as to why this treaty is a big deal and why it's very important to the story of the Lusitania. Now, the part of the Declaration of Paris that you all need to understand for the story of the Lusitania is a section of this declaration that is known as cruiser rules. And the whole point of the cruiser rules part of the declaration was to basically safeguard civilian vessels and civilian lives during a time of war. So this is the easiest way I can explain it. Let's say you have a warship, okay, and it comes across an enemy civilian vessel. This vessel isn't carrying any armaments whatsoever. It's just full of innocent civilians. Well, under the cruiser rules, this warship should try to safeguard those civilian lives. So if they decide to sink the civilian ship, they have to make sure that all the civilians get off the ship before it sinks. Or if they wanted to, they could just do an inspection of this ship, make sure this ship wasn't carrying any weapons or anything like that, and then they could leave the ship alone. However, if they found that this civilian ship was carrying weapons, it could be classified as a ship of war and could be sunk. So this is the simplified version of the cruiser rules thing. You know, the only point of this was just to try to make sure that as few civilian lives were lost as possible.
However, while on paper cruiser rules obviously make sense, and I'm sure during wars of the past they were easier to enforce, but during the First World War, as war technology was evolving rapidly and there were brand new machines of war being implemented, such as submarines and airplanes, it was getting to be harder and harder to safeguard civilian lives during this time period. This was partly due to the fact that while submarines and airplanes were very good tools of war, the downside of these weapons was that it was harder to use them and fine-tune a target to make sure that you're only taking out a military ship or military installation. So, because of this, it was inevitable that some civilian lives would be lost during this brand new era of technological warfare.
Now, while we're on the subject of why both sides had an increasingly difficult time in fine-tuning their targets, there was another issue that came up that made this even worse. You see, during this time period, there were a good number of neutral countries. And when I say neutral countries, I'm referring to countries that weren't directly associated with one side or the other. They were not involved with this war at all. So obviously, these countries weren't to be fired upon by either side.
One such country was the United States of America. The U.S. would remain neutral during World War I until the final years of the war.
And there's also a clause in the whole Declaration of Paris that helps protect these countries. You see, according to the cruiser rules, all vessels sailing across the Atlantic should have a flag up that lets other ships or U-boats know what country this ship belongs to. So if you have an American ship, it's supposed to have up an American flag. If you have a British ship, it's supposed to be hoisting a British flag, and so on and so forth. This is to help protect the lives of people who aren't involved in this conflict. However, there was this growing issue during this time period where ships would hoist a false flag as a form of camouflage. Now, this directly violated the cruiser rules. This was not to be done under any circumstances because as a result of this, this made it more difficult for both sides to know, if they were firing upon an enemy ship or not. So because of this, there were instances out there where British ships were hoisting American flags. And this became such a problem that U-boat captains started, they were like, okay, I can't tell if that's an American ship or a British ship or not. So these U-boats would just assume the worst and torpedo all ships. So because this was a constantly growing problem, it was inevitable that innocent lives that had nothing to do with this conflict would be lost.
Alright, now that we've covered all of that information, we can now continue the story of the Lusitania. Now, for the first 9 to 10 months of the war, the Lusitania was very successful in avoiding trouble. Captaining the ship during this time period was a man by the name of Captain Dow, and he was very well familiar with the Lusitania and he knew how to operate the vessel safely and efficiently. Now, after World War I broke out, Captain Dow was ordered to sail the Lusitania with no flags hoisted. This was also a violation of the cruiser rules, and Captain Dow strongly disagreed with this decision. However, he was forced to do this, so he grudgingly did it and didn't complain too much. After this happened, he continued to operate the Lusitania without issues. However, the stress of everything that was going on was beginning to get to Captain Dow. In March of 1915, he requested to be granted shore leave from the Lusitania, and this request was accepted. After Captain Dow left the Lusitania, Captain Turner returned to the Lusitania once again, and he would be the captain of the vessel throughout the rest of her career.
Following Captain Turner's return to the Lusitania, for the next month or so, everything proceeded pretty smoothly with the ship. The Lusitania continued to operate, sailing back and forth across the Atlantic with no real problems. However, all that changed in May. You see, on May 1st of 1915, the RMS Lusitania was docked in New York City, getting ready to depart for another voyage from New York City to Liverpool. However, what everyone didn't know was that on this particular voyage, the fate of the Lusitania was about to be changed forever.
Now, the Lusitania was due to leave New York City at 12 noon on the 1st of May, 1915. However, during the early hours of the morning on this same particular day, this would have been the time period at which all the Lusitania's passengers would have begun to board the vessel. Now, also right around this same time period, the Lusitania received some last-minute and unexpected and top-secret cargo. You see, secretly, the Lusitania was going to take some small arms munitions from the United States to Great Britain to help assist Britain with the war effort. The munitions included 4,200 cases of Remington rifle cartridges, 1,250 cases of shrapnel shells, and fuses. Now, this cargo was to be kept a complete secret because remember, at this time period the US was supposed to be neutral during World War I. And because the Lusitania was carrying these small arms munitions, this was a complete violation of the Cruiser Rules Agreement, which meant that if the Lusitania was caught carrying these munitions, the Lusitania was a viable military target able to be sunk by German U-boats.
Now, due to the fact that the Lusitania, a vessel that was supposed to be an unarmed civilian passenger liner, was carrying munitions illegally, would be a source of great controversy in later years. However, we'll talk more about that later. For now, the only thing you need to know is, yes, it was true that the Lusitania was illegally carrying munitions in order to help assist with the war effort. However, before we get more into that, what we need to talk about right now is, due to the fact that the US was technically neutral in World War I at this time period, there was a German embassy located in New York City. And due to the fact that the Lusitania, an unarmed passenger liner, quote unquote, was getting ready to sail across the Atlantic, the German embassy issued out a warning, letting all the civilians who were sailing on board the Lusitania know that a state of war existed between Great Britain and her allies, and that anybody who sails on board the Lusitania was doing so at their own risk. This warning appeared in the New York City newspapers at the time. And for the most part, most of the passengers on board the Lusitania just kind of laughed it off. You know, they were thinking, the Germans can't be serious. They wouldn't torpedo an unarmed civilian passenger liner. There is no way that this could happen. So this was the general consensus of the public at the time. However, there were a few people who were supposed to sail on the Lusitania who took this threat seriously and decided to cancel their voyage on board the Lusitania.
Then, at a little bit past 12 noon on the 1st of May, 1915, RMS Lusitania pulled out of the pier and departed New York City, bound for Liverpool for the last time. A couple of hours after the Lusitania departed New York City, she passed a few British destroyers that were just off the coastline, and a crewman on board one of these destroyers took a photograph of the Lusitania as it was sailing out across the Atlantic. This photograph you see here of the Lusitania way off in the distance is the last known photograph to ever be taken of the Lusitania.
Alright everybody, well hey, I hate to do this to all of you, but I think this is a good place to pause the Lusitania timeline series for now. So be sure you tune in next time when we continue the story of the RMS Lusitania. And you know something else, guys? This series has been going on for quite a while now, and I think it's time we officially finish it up. So what I'm going to be doing for the next couple of episodes on the Historic Travelers YouTube channel is just focusing on the Lusitania, and we're going to try to finish telling this vessel's story. Alright everybody, well hey, thank you all so much for watching. Be sure you leave this video a like, be sure to subscribe, and hey, thank you all so much for all the support. I could not do this without each and every single one of you. Alright everybody, well hey, you all take care out there, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good night everybody.
Special thanks to my Captain level Patreon supporters, Jeffrey Clayton, Dakota Charbonneau, Moosh, and Greg Gallick. Thank you all so much for all the support.